welcome to the Caps and Cakes session hosted by ULV. Well, this is an initiative organized in the Risk for Civis Framework project, through which we would like to foster collaboration among our research communities, as I was saying to Dr. Barton. And the Cups and Cakes are organized every 2 Wednesdays at lunchtime, the information can be found in the website. So today I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Joe Barton, who has been granted a prestigious MSCA from the European Commission to study the strategic cultures of cyber warfare. We will have around 20 minutes presentation, and this session will be recorded and will be uploaded to the website. Yes, so I leave you the floor, Dr. Barton, and you can perhaps share your PowerPoint.
Thank you for inviting me to talk. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Letitia said, I'm coming towards the end now of Marie Curie Fellowship Project at University Libre de Bruxelles. The project title is Strategic Cultures of Cyber Warfare, Cyber Cult. And basically, it looks at the reasons for the proliferation of offensive cybersecurity capabilities in the international system, why states are adopting, using, developing, deploying these types of capabilities, and the related instability that is causing. So the presentation that I want to go through today is really a part of this project, which really focuses on the EU as an actor and what is the EU's role in cybersecurity. Is it, or can it in the future maybe adopt a more offensive cybersecurity posture where it supports itself, maybe the development of offensive capabilities, or does really its history, its culture, really as a peace project constrain it from doing that? And really, how is EU policy contributing to more generally the cybersecurity of European Union member states? So that's really the focus of the project, and this is really a small part of what the research that I've been doing over the last couple of years. So the project title is presentation title is Building Resilient Security Cultures, an assessment of the new EU cybersecurity strategy. This is still a bit of a work in progress. I need to develop it a little bit further for the book manuscript, which is going to be the end result of the project, but happy to share what I've done so far. So to give you a little bit of background and context, again, this is part of my Marie Curie Fellowship project, and the picture here on the right of the screen really situates this bit of research within the broader project that I'm doing. I'm actually looking at a variety of cultural influences on cyber warfare, including at the supranational level, including the role of NATO and the US alliance system. I'm looking at what I refer to as subcultures of cyber warfare, hacker communities, hawks in the military sector who are developing and deploying these capabilities, and also the private sector denoted by the moniker hawkers. And I'm also looking at a variety of national cultures, how countries and their histories, their ideas, behaviors, beliefs actually shape their national development of cyber capabilities. But this presentation really, again, is about the EU, and it's really an analysis of the latest European Union cybersecurity strategy, which was released in December 2020. The EU cybersecurity strategy is now in its third iteration, its third phase. Generally, international organizations and nations update their cybersecurity strategies periodically because obviously the technology changes quite quickly. And the European Union strategy is really, I think, a key part of the EU's more general approach to security. It's wanting to be a more assertive and prominent actor in security and defence. It's part also of what the EU has described as the next digital decade, a key part of making Europe secure in the context of ongoing digitalization processes, both domestically in European Union states and globally. And it's also part of other EU policy agendas, including around digital sovereignty, for example, this idea of digital sovereignty protecting supply chains, for example, and also the EU's desire for strategic autonomy, which is its belief that it needs to be able to act autonomously from the United States or other partners in ensuring its own security. So it's a key part of it, EU more general policy processes, and really this paper presents an analysis of the strategy, seeks to identify what its strengths and weaknesses are, and the issues perhaps that are likely to determine how effectively the strategy is implemented. Go on to the next slide. So really the overarching argument of the paper is that the EU's strategy, particularly this latest version, emerges from a particular EU strategic cultural context, which is based on the peaceful settlement of disputes, non-militarized approaches to cybersecurity, a preference really for more of a defensive posture, including resilience building measures, and those sorts of measures rather than more disruptive or offensive tools employed in a collective framework or context. And what I suggest or argue in the paper is that this is a good approach in some ways. To having a defensively orientated security culture may yield significant benefits for the EU, including allowing it to develop further as a distinctive global leader in cybersecurity. And I would argue really that the EU is already a cybersecurity leader globally. People look at the EU as a model for cybersecurity cooperation. But there's some tension here as well, and maybe this defensive approach is kind of out of sync with a more offensive environment in which actually quite a lot of EU members and indeed other states, including China and Russia and others, are actually actively deploying offensive capabilities, hacking tools in their military and intelligence establishments, really to subvert, exploit, degrade, disrupt adversary computer networks. So the question really is, can the EU reconcile this defensive strategic culture, which we know is very much part of the European project, and its normative aspirations for cybersecurity with perhaps potentially a more assertive role in kind of countering adversarial actions, responding to the more offensive strategic environment in which the EU now exists. And what I suggest towards the end of the paper is perhaps a way of doing this is actually to support the emergence of what I would call resilient security cultures across sectors in the EU area. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. So the kinds of the key foci of the paper and the arguments that I'm making. Let me go on to talk a little bit about strategic culture as a framework, because this is obviously important in terms of the overall Marie Curie project that I'm working on, but also this bit of the paper especially. And strategic culture really emerged during the Cold War period. There was a literature emerged in the international relations discipline, which really sought to examine really the national character of nations and how nations did things in certain ways according to their history, their culture, and long-term political and historical processes. A lot of the early research was actually focused on the United States, and strategic culture scholars suggested, for example, that there was an American way of doing things in the Cold War environment that was based on the US culture, its historical experience, its political experience, and also its historical geographical insularity and its attachment to isolationism, for example. And scholars argued, including Colin Gray and others, that there were certain beliefs or ideas that really, again, were historically grounded and which animated the way the United States acted in international affairs. That American wars were just wars, for example, that the country could achieve anything, this kind of belief in omnipotence, particularly stemming from the successful prosecution of wars up until Vietnam, at least. and a connected belief that the strength of the US economy could mobilize enough resources to defeat any adversary in an armed conflict. These were the kind of central animating ideas that drove US foreign policy during the Cold War. They were a result of historical experiences, and they actually led the US to act in certain ways during the Cold War. If we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, this was deeply rooted in what was known as the Monroe Doctrine. When the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba during the Cold War, the American reaction was grounded in the Monroe Doctrine, the belief that essentially the Western Hemisphere was the US hemisphere, and the principle really that the US would guard against any foreign interference in the Western Hemisphere, particularly by the Soviet Union. And there was a sense during the Cold War that Khrushchev didn't really understand American strategic culture, didn't understand their attachment to the Monroe Doctrine, and thus putting nuclear missiles in Cuba was a much bigger deal to the Americans than Khrushchev thought it might be, because he didn't understand US strategic culture. It also explains, again, US involvement in Vietnam, for example. Their belief in omnipotence, that they could win the war, that ultimately they would prevail because they had prevailed in so many other conflicts historically, stopped America from seeing the reality of the situation in that conflict, which was that they were losing and that the public support for the war was draining, and ultimately, as we know, the Viet Cong took over Saigon, South Vietnam, and it was a strategic disaster for the Americans. And again, this literature emerged during the Cold War to kind of explain the dynamics of the Cuban Missile Crisis of Vietnam. But equally, this concept is very relevant in the modern context. If we look, for example, at Afghanistan, right, this belief that the disaster, arguably, that's just unfolded in Afghanistan with the US withdrawal and the Taliban recapturing Afghanistan, again, what strategic culture scholars would say was, well, this was a result, again, of this American belief, this American strategic culture that they can prevail, that they can win wars, that they ultimately have the economic and military strength to defeat any adversary. This is part of American strategic culture and kind of leads to oftentimes strategic mistakes. So this is kind of the idea of strategic culture. And actually, since the Cold War, it's been a concept that's been applied not just to the US, but many nations now. And indeed, there's an emerging literature on the influence of strategic culture on international organizations. So the idea is that international organizations like the EU or NATO themselves have particular strategic cultures, ways of doing things, beliefs, norms, patterns of behavior, which influence the way they act in international affairs, and that can be both positively and negatively. So let's turn to the focus of the project and this presentation, which is the EU. Does the EU have a strategic culture? This is something scholars have begun to debate, and obviously, if we want to understand how the EU acts in security and defence, or cybersecurity specifically, the basic premise is here that, well, maybe the EU has a strategic culture which then affects the way it acts in particular policy areas. So what I've done in the first main section of the paper, the empirical section, is actually have a look at the literature and what existing scholars have said about EU strategic culture, and try and derive what are the kind of key characteristics of an EU strategic culture, even if it does exist. Again, there's been a proliferating literature on this, and this kind of graphs sums it up. So ultimately, and probably unlike the US in some ways, the EU strategic culture is peace-oriented. It has a historical role as an actor concerned with peace and security. It emerged obviously out of the carnage of the Second World War. It was a peace project advancing economic cooperation initially, and obviously cooperation around a much broader range of areas since then. So its attachment to peace, promoting peace, is a key part, arguably, of the EU strategic culture. Soft power also comes up in the literature, the idea of not necessarily using the military to achieve strategic and political objectives, but the power of persuasion, the power of attraction, the power of ideals, and the power of the EU's values. These are a key part of how the EU acts in international affairs. The EU also has quite a legal and bureaucratic culture. It looks to impose laws and regulations on its members, and also seeks to promote norms and international law in areas in which it has a strategic interest internationally. And sometimes EU policy can be quite legalistic and bureaucratic. And again, this explains maybe the pace at which it acts sometimes, or the issue areas indeed that it becomes involved in. It's fundamentally an actor concerned with rules, norms and values, and promoting them again within the EU and internationally. There's also this interesting relationship between, in the existing literature about EU strategic culture, around restraint and this idea of comprehensive security. So the EU strategic culture, firstly, is one of restraint, in that it's very careful how it proceeds, because it needs to manage national sensibilities, national competencies, and national priorities. So it's careful to consult, to mediate, to involve nations, to not step on the national responsibilities of nation states, and in that way it is quite a restrained actor. But almost paradoxically as well, the EU, over the course of its 70 odd years of existence, has become a very comprehensive actor as well, in that it's involved in economic affairs, social affairs, cultural affairs, politics, law, society, and increasingly, particularly over the last decade or so, trying to take this more assertive position in security and defence. So at a conceptual level, there are kind of some inherent tensions in EU strategic culture between wanting to be restrained and not, step on the toes of member states, but also wanting this comprehensive role across a range of policy areas. And as Thierry Tardy has said, EU security culture reflects a certain way to handle crises through a mix of civilian and military responses, a focus on rather short-term and consensual activities, almost always in support of existing state authorities and in accordance with international legal instruments and a set of values and principles. So when we look at the, contrasting with the United States and its particular national character, these are kind of some of the key strategic cultural aspects of the EU, which we would expect to shape its behaviour, the way, and its policy making in a variety of domains. These are kind of the key ingredients of an EU strategic culture, if indeed there is one, and it has an influence. So that's the kind of conceptual bit of the paper, and it links to, again, the literature on EU strategic culture. And then what I'm trying to do in the rest of the paper really is look at, well, actually, is this strategic culture real? Does it have an influence on cybersecurity? Does it shape EU policy making in this particular domain? So the first way I do this is actually through an analysis of a variety of different documents, policy statements, speeches, again, looking at, well, how actually do EU policymakers perceive and interpret the strategic environment? And this is the idea that strategic culture is actually a lens. If you think a certain way because of your culture, you will interpret the exogenous environment in a certain way and react to it in a certain way. So this is a core part of how strategic culture has been received, has been explained and delineated before. So this section really looks at, again, how do policymakers think about, perceive the strategic environment, and does that exhibit elements of the characteristics of the strategic culture that I've just described? So first of all, there's signs that security is actually a bit more, perhaps a bit less legal and bureaucratic, and a bit more adaptive than you might think, particularly in recent years in response to the COVID pandemic. And the COVID pandemic has created a lot of cybersecurity problems and issues for the European Union and EU member states. And the EU has been quite, probably a less legalistic and bureaucratic organisation, has been quite adaptive to thinking about and responding to some of these threats. To give you some examples, during the pandemic, about 40% of the EU workforce has been remote working, and this, of course, has presented great cybersecurity challenges for protecting computers that are being run on much more distributed networks. We've had, for an example, what's been referred to as an infodemic of disinformation surrounding the pandemic, which has needed to be countered through truthful narratives about what's going on in relation to the vaccine hesitancy, all this kind of stuff. And we've had an increased wave of pharmaceutical espionage, countries conducting cyber attacks against vaccine suppliers and producers to steal intellectual property, for example, and also a big increase generally in cybercrime, but also COVID-related cybercrime. So malicious actors, criminal groups using phishing scams, sending emails, trying to get people to click on links in ways that will lead to the exploitation of their computers, with sort of COVID subject matter or COVID taglines in the email to encourage people to click on malicious links. So the EU cybersecurity strategy, again, and what is revealed when you look at how policymakers are thinking about this, is again quite adaptive to new and evolving challenges in this area. And the EU have put in place a variety of cybersecurity related policy recommendations and papers and research in response to the COVID pandemic and the way it's impacted cybercrime. Policymakers also have a reasonably clear kind of threat perception about cyber security, and this is another part of strategic culture. An element of strategic culture is the extent to which actors within a country or an organization think about who the threats are, to the same extent or in the same ways. And the EU has quite a common view, particularly of the threats posed by China and Russia. We've seen over the last couple of years, which influenced the strategy, I think, major attacks by Chinese hacker groups on the Microsoft Exchange servers. Concerns also in the EU area and in EU policy making about the US, particularly under the Trump administration, which was implementing new cybersecurity policies and strategies such as persistent engagement and defending forward, which involves the United States intelligence and military agencies actively disrupting and deterring cyber threats in, at times, EU networks. So there were concerns, again, which fed into the digital sovereignty debate, and also, I think, a clear sense among EU policymakers about the threats posed by non-state actors in this area, including the rise of ransomware in particular, where computers get locked down by malicious software, and the hackers demand a ransom, usually in Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, to free up the computer. So how these geopolitical dynamics, there's a fairly kind of clear sense, a clear strategic culture, if you like, on the threat perception in the EU. Who are the threats? What are they? What do we need to deal with? So that's an important part of EU strategic culture, which I think is reflected in again, the documents that I've looked at for this part of the project. The EU again exhibits probably this more comprehensive strategic culture as well, in that it's really seeking to promote globally international law and norms through its cyber diplomacy. The EU has in recent years become very involved in international fora, including the UN governmental group of experts process and the open-ended working group at the UN, which is really looking to establish and agree on international norms that can govern cybersecurity internationally. The EU has been trying to promote new technological alliances internationally, promoting GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, as an international exemplar of how you can do data protection, and also more generally trying to promote its values internationally. So, this idea of comprehensive security, the EU being a values, rules-based actor, again, is reflected in what's been happening in the EU in recent years and what it's been seeking to do internationally. The EU obviously started as a a forum for economic cooperation, particularly in the steel and coal industries, and really that element of it is I think a part of its strategic culture. The EU sees itself as a forum for economic cooperation, probably still primarily, and this is reflected again in how it approaches cybersecurity. So it talks a lot in the strategy, for example, about the severe skills shortages in Europe, the 291,000 posts for cybersecurity professionals that remain unfilled. It talks about the EU's role in cyber capacity building, i.e. training people, enhancing knowledge and skills in the European area, and the EU can have a substantive role in that. And policymakers also often refer to and see cybersecurity in the context of more general economic market dynamics, including the probably over-consolidation of the tech market and the predominance of a few big companies in this space, which probably have an unhealthy amount of influence, and also concerns more generally about things like digital supply chains. You know, where are we getting our data from? Where are we getting our hardware and software from? Is it secure? What kind of economic and trading relationships do we need to have with other countries in order to be more cyber secure? So this element of being economic focused, again, a key facet of what the EU is all about. Its inherent political culture is an economic one. This is very much reflected in how EU policymakers see cybersecurity, essentially. And lastly, policymakers are cognizant of the challenge of particularly around emerging technologies, AI, 5G, the Internet of Things. Obviously, we've had some quite contentious debates around these topics in Europe recently, particularly around the role of Chinese 5G telecommunications providers. But these challenges of new technologies aren't perhaps seen as the US would see them, in more of a kind of a military intelligence frame. They're seen as really tools, technologies that can have more of an economic and societal impact. The security implications of these technologies are beginning to be considered by the EU, particularly through the European Defence Agency, the EDA, PESCO, Permanent Structures Cooperation between the EU, NATO, and a variety of other defence initiatives. But predominantly, and again, this might present a challenge going forward for the EU. Predominantly, the EU is seeing these technologies in an economic and social sense, when in fact lots of countries now are seeking to utilize them in more offensive ways for intelligence operations, for surveillance, for war fighting, for strategic advantage, for subversion, to spread disinformation. And again, there's a sense in which perhaps this view of emerging technologies in the EU, based on its strategic culture, might be a bit out of sync in respect of how other countries are viewing their technology. So again, this is the first kind of major empirical part of the paper. It's an analysis of how EU policymakers see cybersecurity challenges, and I think largely we can see some of those core characteristics of EU strategic culture reflected in these sorts of perceptions and how EU policymakers kind of organize their thoughts, if you like. The second bit of the paper really, well, it's actually the third bit, because the conceptual part is the first bit, but the third bit of the paper really looks at the strategy itself, which is, you know, probably a 15-20 page document, which sets out everything the EU wants to do in cybersecurity and sets its strategic direction. So this part of the research really looks at that strategy and seeks to see or to understand whether the EU strategic culture, as it's been described in the literature, is reflected in the strategy itself or embodied in the strategy itself. And I think we can see that quite clearly in a number of ways. The strategy ultimately is built around three pillars: resilience, technological sovereignty, and leadership, building operational capacity to prevent, deter, respond, and thirdly, advancing a global and open cyberspace. And I think particularly, again, when it comes to resilience, which is more of a defensive recovery based framework for cybersecurity, this idea of cyber resilience is basically premised on if computer networks are attacked or they stop working, you've got to be able to recover and rebuild those networks so that they can provide the digital connectivity on which more general services provide. So it's kind of a defensive mechanism, and that's very prominent again in the strategy. Probably the core concept of the strategy is resilience, which is a defensive thing. Again, that reflects the EU's historic strategic culture. It's also very much a values-driven document, and again, if you look at the cybersecurity strategies of other countries or other international organizations, they don't necessarily place so much emphasis on values, but the EU strategy specifically talks about an open cyberspace which is grounded in the rule of law, human rights, freedoms, and democratic values. So here is the EU really pinning its colours to the wall, saying we approach cybersecurity strategy as a values-based policy area. We want to use cyberspace to promote our values, to protect human rights, freedom of speech, privacy, all these things that we're attached to in Europe. And that, again, is very much reflected in what the strategy says. The strategy also, again, reflects the literature which says the EU strategic culture is based on this idea of comprehensive security. So it's not a narrow view of security, it's a very all-encompassing one. And the strategy particularly talks about the need for the EU to do work to help promote the protection of electricity grids, banks, planes, the aviation sector, public administrations, hospitals. Again, we've had a big rise in cyber attacks directed against hospitals in recent years, energy grids, railways, data centers, public administrations, research labs, manufacturing of critical medical devices and medicines, as well as other critical infrastructure and services. So the EU sees its role as very broad and sees its role really as existing and being important across a whole host of different sectors, economic and social sectors in the EU area, including public administration. So I think when you see this language, again, it reflects this idea of a comprehensive security culture that the EU has had for quite a long time. And also we see in the strategy itself this idea of restraint surfacing again as well, particularly around EU soft regulatory power, particularly what is known as the 5G Toolbox has become an important policy tool, which is really trying to encourage states to protect their 5G infrastructure when they are developing it, not mandating them to do so, but giving them some of the tools, some of the suggestions, some of the ways which they can build 5G infrastructure in a safe and secure way. So again, we see this kind of notion of restraint, not wanting to kind of mandate to countries how to do 5G infrastructure, but doing more, the power of persuasion, the soft power stuff, soft regulation. Again, this is reflected in the strategy. We also see, though, a little bit of change and a little bit of pressure, I think, on the EU to become more assertive and to want to move towards a position where it can start countering what is more broadly happening in the cyber environment internationally, which really is the deterioration, the spread of cyber warfare capabilities, and so on and so forth. So we see, for example, deterrence as a concept and policy priority becoming much more prominent in this strategy than we have seen in previous strategies. It doesn't fully define the EU's approach to deterrence, but this kind of language, deterring cyber attacks, is more often associated with a more offensive posture. And there's language in there on tackling cybercrime and how this is a key factor in ensuring cybersecurity. Deterrence cannot be achieved through resilience alone, but also requires identification and prosecution of offenders. So again, it's not necessarily suggesting, a military role or the EU conducting cyber attacks itself, but it's becoming a more punitive, assertive actor in responding to malicious activity, whether that's through sanctions, prosecutions, investigations, again, these sorts of legal measures. Deterrence via offensive disruptive operations are still left to the nations. So there's this a sense again that the EU is reluctant or restrained in moving towards that more offensive posture and wants to rely on member states to do so. The strategy does suggest a stronger intelligence function for the EU in this area, which could be a securitizing move. And some of the discourse, the language in the strategy kind of denotes, again, a more protective, assertive role for the EU, including a language like creating a cyber shield, having cyber watchtowers. You know, this is kind of sort of prison, criminal law enforcement type language as applied to the cyber domain. And this is, I think, gives us an interesting insight into the way EU policymakers are looking at this domain and how to act in it. And there's also an emphasis on actually building strategic culture, right? So I think EU policymakers recognize that, yes, the EU does have a strategic culture, but it's not, again, one necessarily that's always well suited to, again, the more offensive environment in which the EU exists. So through various training and exercising programs, the EU is seeking to build some common ideas, beliefs, threat perceptions around cyber through some of the projects it's running and the way it's training EU officials, EU military personnel, people who are attached to CSDP missions and operations, for example, to try and kind of build a common idea of the threats that cybersecurity entails and how to respond to them in the EU. Lastly, the paper looks really at kind of where does the EU go from here? I think that there is some kind of pressure or impetus in the EU for it to move towards a more offensive posture. It kind of wants to do that, or at least some people in Europe want it to do that. But there are some real strategic tensions and political tensions here, and I think this speaks to a broader strategic culture literature on how strategic culture changes. So, you know, we shouldn't assume that the strategic culture of the United States is going to be that way forever, or that indeed the EU's strategic culture is going to be that way forever. So if the EU does want to change to become a more assertive strategic actor, to take a more offensive or disruptive role in cybersecurity, again, as some people I think would really like it to, strategic culture might act as a brake on it doing so, and it sort of provides some kind of political inertia for the EU to move into this kind of more offensive stance. And these are some of the challenges I identified in the last section of the paper. Ultimately, there's still a debate about whether cyber is a national competency, and that this process of the denationalization of cyber policy, I think, is quite important. Ultimately, there's a paradox here. Cyber security requires extensive cooperation, intelligence sharing, reporting. The EU also has a very much interconnected attack service. So if you attack a critical infrastructure provider in France, or an energy grid in France, it's not just going to affect France, it's going to affect neighboring countries. So there's an interdependency here. And again, the paradox is that there are these interdependencies and a need for multinational cooperation, but the EU is still saying, well, cyber is a national responsibility. So really, it's overcoming that paradox, figuring out how to deal with that, again, is a fundamental challenge in the cybersecurity area, as indeed it has been in other policy areas too. What to do about parallel processes? So you have some members within the EU adopting offensive capabilities and not others. So there are growing gaps of emerging concerns about free riding in the EU. So, you know, are the more assertive, capable, offensive cyber powers, such as France or such as the Netherlands, are they going to provide the offensive capabilities to protect other EU members? And again, that potentially creates a free riding problem where some people are invested in these capabilities and others aren't, and then you get disparities and capability gaps emerging within the EU. So this is another problem. Cooperation with NATO is obviously important, and there is, I think, at least a potential for a strategic cultural clash between those two organizations. The main difference being obviously NATO has the United States in it, who is a much more assertive actor in cybersecurity, has been actually putting, I think, some pressure on allies within the NATO membership to upskill in offensive cybersecurity so that they can share some of the burden of doing offensive cyber operations. And again, that clash between that kind of US-led NATO and that more peace-oriented EU, I think, is perhaps only just beginning to play out. And in this sense, the strategic culture, the differing strategic culture of those organizations aren't particularly conducive to cooperation. And what I've suggested in the paper and in other areas is the EU might need what's known as a SCEP for cyber. This is a NATO policy framework called Sovereign Cyber Effects Produced Voluntarily by Allies. This is a new policy that NATO has adopted, where if NATO is running a mission or operation, one of its members can conduct cyber attacks on behalf of and in support of that operation. And what I'm suggesting is the EU might need a similar kind of policy framework, maybe for common security and defence policy, CSDP, missions and operations. So if the EU has a military operation in Africa, for example, and there's a need to conduct a cyber attack to take out a malicious actor, to stop them operating, maybe that can be provided voluntarily by one of the EU members. So one of the ways the EU could potentially move towards having a more offensive role whilst maintaining committed to the more peaceful operation is to develop a SCEP for CSTP. I hope that makes sense. And really the last part of the paper, which I'm still working on, is this idea of building resilient security cultures as the way forward for the EU. The EU has a lot of coordinating power. It has a lot of contact with the private sector in particular. So helping private sector organizations really to better defend their networks, to adapt their own behaviors and ideas and threat perceptions about cyber, doing that at a corporate industrial level, but also at a national level, so that there's a greater convergence in ideas and beliefs within the member states about what the cyber threats are and what they need to do about them, and also building this kind of EU level security culture based on resilience. I think that kind of that multi-level approach to security cultures, the EU, again, with its convening power, with its strong large bureaucracy, with its significant funding that it can bring to bear, this might be the kind of way forward, and that final part of the paper really kind of delineates and expands on that as an idea. So I'll leave it there. Thank you out there in cyberspace for listening to me. I welcome any feedback on this paper. I know that this is taking place in the context of a broader CIVIS network, so if anyone's working on cybersecurity, interested in future collaborations, please do get in contact with me, joe.burton@ulb.ac.be. It would be a pleasure to hear from you, and thanks, Letitia. Hopefully I didn't rabbit on too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It was a very detailed presentation, and it was very interesting. And I think that, cybersecurity, it's in everyday's news right now. I mean, I don't think that anybody it's completely foreign to all these news, including ULB, actually. And I don't know if there are any questions. So I just... Simone.
So, thanks, Joe, for the presentation. It was extremely illuminating. And I'm a PhD researcher and assistant at the Sevipol. And actually, I'm working on something else. Actually, mainly working on the link between the action of foreign actors, such as China, for instance, and the autocratization processes in the Western Balkans. So actually, I'm definitely out of my comfort zone. Nevertheless, I mean, I have a couple of questions. Actually, you already answered to the first one. It was about the cooperation between the EU and NATO. So thanks. Basically, you anticipated my question. The second one is, the article I've just copy pasted in the chat is about this subject. So how could you ensure actually all the member states follow the line on this subject? And I'm mainly referring to Hungary, because I guess that we are all familiar with the fact that Hungary has been more than eager to interact with China, also in the security domain. And so I wonder, precisely for what you explained, so that actually today on this field, actually the EU is so interconnected, how can we ensure that actually among member states namely Hungary in this specific regard, does not act as a Trojan horse for foreign powers, also like without being fully conscious, of this. But actually, just because, I mean, for their strategic and political goals, they are willing to interact with Russia, with China, and they are not that aware that this interaction is damaging, is detrimental not just for them, but also for the EU as a whole. Because actually, you have been talking about EU strategic culture, but as you mentioned already, actually there are two different layers. So we all know that actually member states might not necessarily be on the same page with the EU. Is the question clear?
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's a really good question. I think you've highlighted some really important issues. I mean, I think that you know, personally, I'm sort of concerned about a democratic backsliding in the EU area and in NATO more generally, and I think that China are playing a clever game in terms of their technology, and that they're aggressively pursuing openings and share of the commercial market in the EU, despite increasing resistance to that and reluctance among lots of European countries now to adopt and integrate Chinese technologies into their digital infrastructure. I've spent most of my career in New Zealand, actually, and this has been a big issue in New Zealand around the Huawei 5G and the political tensions that it could potentially cause with these countries, and populist leaders like Orban have taken a divergent route and want to have closer relations with Russia and China. I think this presents a huge challenge for the EU politically. At a conceptual level, I think it speaks to the fact that strategic cultures aren't homogenous in international organizations. There is literature which says, well, the EU doesn't really have an overarching strategic culture. It's really a connection of national cultures, right? And right now, Hungarian national culture is quite different from lots of other European countries. So this speaks to perhaps the conceptual debate which is occurring around strategic culture, which is to say that really national strategic cultures are much stronger and will sometimes override organizational international ones, and the strategic cultures that are trying to be built at that more intergovernmental multilateral level. So I think that there's a sort of theoretical conceptual point to be made there about the skepticism with which some people view the EU's ability to build a common strategic culture. Your question, what can you do about a country who's potentially creating problems in cybersecurity or taking a more divergent approach? I guess the EU's approach, as I mentioned in the presentation, is more this soft regulatory approach. So, particularly it's around the 5G Toolbox, which is really about putting out a set of recommendations about how you protect digital infrastructure from Chinese or other surveillance. But the EU is not in a position to mandate Hungary that you have to block Chinese providers, or you have to use, Nokia or Ericsson to supply your telecommunications infrastructure. The EU, I don't think, is in a position to do that. The EU could put in place some kind of penalties, either monetary or political penalties, for countries that diverge from common security policies in the digital space, which present wider challenges for Europe. That would be something that they could do, but again, that would create perhaps even worse political problems, which would bolster the likes of Orban and give him that external enemy that he wants to kind of frame his populism around. I think the broader issue is does it really matter if Orban has a closer digital relationship with China and is using Huawei infrastructure? Because the Chinese have shown themselves very adept, actually, at subverting networks via other means, right? You don't need necessarily Huawei digital infrastructure or Chinese digital infrastructure to conduct major cyber attacks or exfiltrate information. The Chinese and Russians have proved very adept at doing that. By targeting actually, US systems and infrastructure. I mentioned briefly the attack on the Microsoft Exchange server. So look, I think you've identified a real challenge. I don't have the answer to it. I don't think the EU has the answer to it, but it presents a thorny problem. Again, it speaks to this broader debate about national and EU level priorities, which applies to lots of different policy areas. I felt I'd given you quite a vague answer, but I hope that was helpful in some ways, at least.
Yeah, I think actually there's so much to discuss.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, we basically agree that the issue of, like, let's say, divergent member states, actually, that's a key one. And now I just have a very practical question, because unfortunately I skipped the first part of your presentation. I'm sorry, actually, I was teaching.
That's okay, no problem.
So I got actually you speaking about the paper, when and where is this published, sir? Or is it going to be published?
So yeah, it's still in development. It's probably actually going to be a chapter in the book that I'm doing from the project. So it hasn't been published yet. I've still got to finish that last section on resilient security cultures, which I mentioned. But I'm doing basically a book which is going to be called Cyber Culture: Strategic Cultures of Cyber Warfare, which is one of the main deliverables of the project. Happy to send it to you. Either when I've got a full draft of the chapter, or indeed hopefully when the book comes out. Happy to send you the details of it, but it's unpublished work at the moment.
Okay, because actually, just give me a sec. So I'm working with another researcher.
Yeah.
And on similar topics. Actually, he's a member of the computational privacy group at Imperial College. Wow. I don't know if you know this group, actually, and he has been the leading rapporteur for the crafting of the guidelines of the application of GDPR in the domain of the anonymization.
Interesting.
And we are working. We actually not exactly working. Actually, we have started like reflecting upon similar issues. So maybe you could find like anything interesting like in his profile. And yeah, thank you very much.
That's great. Yeah, please do reach out. I've put my email in the chat as well, and happy to follow up. As I say, I think the intention of these seminars is to try and create links and collaboration. So yeah, it'd be nice to hear from you and link up with your colleague.
And
yes, thanks, Leticia, for organizing. Yes, thank you both. Actually, this is what we are aiming for, that you create connections. And obviously, the CVIS network is also at your disposition. We have representatives in the other universities. So if, for example, you are right now thinking, well, in the future, maybe for a project, European project, we have just recently published a call for that. So there are funds to help you build up such a project. So please let me know as well and keep me updated. And thank you very much, Dr. Barton, for sharing your presentation today. And I think we can end the presentation for today. It will be uploaded to the webpage. I will send it to the communication team. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to be here. Cheers.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.